Hi, I'm Steve. You can call me Steve. I received a tongue-in-cheek, smart-ass request to explain the strong nuclear force and present a grand unified theory. Rather than treat it as a tongue-in-cheek, smart-ass request, I'm going to have a go at it. The universe is governed by four fundamental forces: gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. They're fundamental in the sense that they can't be explained in terms of other forces. They're the building blocks, and everything else is explained in terms of them. Strictly speaking, they're fundamental interactions, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to stick with forces. Some of these forces you're probably familiar with, like gravity. There's also electromagnetism, which is how I'm recording this video and how you're watching it. These are the forces that operate on scales people can experience, so they're easy to explain with simple demonstrations. The two nuclear forces are a little trickier. There might also be a fifth force, but he left before they got famous. The nuclear forces, as the name suggests, operate in the nucleus of an atom, or rather the nuclei of every atom. The strong force is what holds a nucleus together, and the weak force causes it to fall apart, which is not strictly 100% accurate, but is a good enough explanation for now. As this is a video about the strong force, that's all I'm going to say about the weak force. An atomic nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. These are part of a class of particles called hadrons, and I'm going to keep saying hadrons from now on because it's easier than saying protons and neutrons all the time. It is pronounced hadron, not hadron or never mind. Protons have a positive charge and neutrons are neutral. If you cram a bunch of positive charges together, they'll want to repel each other and fly apart. Adding neutral particles to keep them separated can suppress this tendency, but only to a limited extent. In lighter atoms like carbon and oxygen, the ratio of neutrons to protons is about 1 to 1. In heavy atoms like uranium, that ratio is more like 1.5 to 1, or 3 neutrons for every 2 protons, if you prefer to think in whole numbers. As the field of particle physics developed, it turned out that just having neutral peacekeepers wasn't enough to keep the nucleus together, and a deeper explanation was needed. There was clearly another force acting because we weren't observing atoms spontaneously flying apart into clouds of free protons. So what's happening? Well, up until now, I've always pictured the nucleus as a little cluster of balls stuck together, happily twirling around, but otherwise just hanging out. Just like pretty much everything else in science, it's not that simple. It's actually a seething cauldron of particles popping in and out of existence, and other particles swapping identities. Your standard carbon atom contains 6 protons and 6 neutrons, on average. Pairs of protons and neutrons are constantly switching which is which. They're not switching positions. The proton is becoming the neutron, and vice versa. They do this through the strong force, as embodied by virtual particles called pions, after the Greek letter pi. One hadron will fire a pion at its neighbor, and they'll switch identities, and this process creates an attractive force between them. This is happening constantly, so there's a constant network of attractions between various hadrons in the nucleus. The pions are what's called a force carrier. They're the vehicle by which the interaction happens. So why did I call them virtual particles? The universe likes to balance its books. The amount of energy going into a process must equal the amount coming out. But it turns out you can cheat if you do it really quickly before the universe notices. The pion requires something like 9 times the amount of energy available in a proton just to exist. So it borrows that energy from somewhere, quickly does what it needs to do, and then vanishes before anyone catches on. How quickly? The time span in which it can get away with this is about the time it takes to cross the width of the nucleus, which is why the strong nuclear force only acts within the nucleus and not at scales that humans can observe and be familiar with. Incidentally, my description of virtual particles is a greatly simplified attempt to convey a somewhat contentious concept, so I wouldn't repeat it to any particle physicists in your life unless you want an earful and possibly an hour-long lecture with graphs and math. And that's the strong nuclear force. Except not, because that's just the residual force, the stuff that's left over after the primary interaction has happened. It holds the nucleus together, but it also holds the hadrons together. Hadrons are made up of 3 quarks, which are named for gibberish, as far as I can tell. Quarks are held together by another set of virtual particles called gluons, because they glue the quarks together. Look, I don't name these things. Gluon interactions are much more complicated than pions, and much more mind-bending. It's not a simple matter of 3 quarks stuck together with gluons, like we saw with the hadrons. If you pump energy into this system, it gets converted into more and more gluons. They're like the rabbits of the particle world. It's like having 3 meatballs buried in a plate of spaghetti, where the meatballs are the quarks and the spaghetti is the gluons. But if you do anything at all to the meatballs, all you get is more spaghetti. If you try to pull one meatball out to examine it, it generates its own spaghetti halo. And before long you have a new plate of 3 meatballs, plus the original 3 meatball plate. This is how it was explained to me, and my takeaway from this is that I should open a quark-based spaghetti restaurant. I touched briefly on the grand unified theory, sometimes called the theory of everything. I've also carefully avoided mentioning anything mathematical. Math is the language of physics, and so far I haven't described any of these physics concepts in their own language. There's a reason for that, because the math gets really gnarly really quickly, and I'd have to spend years learning myself before I could explain it to all of you. Nevertheless, I'm going to talk about math without describing any math. Each of these 4 forces, or interactions, was originally described with its own set of mathematical formulae, completely separate from the other 3. At some point, physicists wondered if it was possible to describe all 4 with one grand set of equations and tie everything in the universe up neatly with one elegant theory. So far that's been a little difficult. In 1979, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Sheldon Glashow, which I probably pronounced wrong, Abdus Salam and Steven Weinberg for their work in combining the weak force with electromagnetism, now called the electroweak force. However, gravity and the strong force remain separate. So, if you're thinking about physics as a career, and you're looking for a thesis topic, the strong force is one of the fundamental interactions of the universe. It holds quarks together to make hadrons, and it holds hadrons together to make nuclei. It operates using extremely short-lived particles over extremely short distances, which is why it's not something that's immediately intuitive to those of us who live at much larger scales. It's the reason anything exists at all, and the universe isn't simply a soup of free-floating quarks. And now, I'll leave you with another smart-ass request, jazzy trombone music. It's partially entertainment and partially a way to pad out the video so that YouTube's algorithms might actually notice it. Thanks for watching. I've been Steve.